A 13-year-old boy stands at the front of a classroom, staring at a calculus problem written to destroy him. His teacher smiles, the kind of smile that has ended students before. 5 minutes, she says, or it's detention for a week. The room laughs. Front row laughs loudest. But nobody in that room knows what this boy does after midnight. Nobody knows about the library book, 3 weeks overdue. Nobody knows why he can't sit down, or what's hidden under the back of his shirt. He picks up the marker. The laughter dies. Line by line, the impossible problem starts to fall. A girl in the back corner looks up. The teacher's smile begins to crack. 4 seconds of silence. Then she reaches for the eraser and does something that will burn her 27-year career to the ground. She has no idea. He turns around. The kitchen floor was cold. Not carpet cold. Not the kind of cold you fix by putting on socks. Tile cold. The deep kind that comes up the floors and settles in your knees and stays there for the rest of the night, whether you want it to or not. Elijah Osei had been sitting on it for 2 hours, maybe closer to 3. I stopped counting somewhere around page 2 of chapter 9, when the integral started doing something in his head. Not a sound exactly, more like a shape, the kind that doesn't have a name but you know it when you see it. Clean, inevitable. The way fits a lock before you've even touched it. The textbook was thick, library thick, the kind that belongs on a graduate student shelf and collects fine dust next to someone's unfinished thesis. Elijah had found it on a table in the community branch 6 months ago, left behind by whoever had checked it out before him. He checked it out instead. The due date stamped inside the cover said 3 weeks ago. He hadn't returned it, couldn't not yet. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead, yellow, a little tired. The kind of light that's been doing its job for so long it's forgotten what good light looks like. Everything else in the apartment was dark. His sister Naya, 9 years old, was asleep in the room they shared. She slept heavy and deep, the sleep of someone who hadn't started carrying things yet. Elijah used to sleep like that. He didn't remember exactly when that stopped. He pressed the eraser end of his pencil against his bottom lip and stared at the page. The problem on page 212 was not easy. Not for a 13-year-old. Not for most people, honestly. Integration by substitution with a trigonometric component. The kind of problem that required 2 distinct substitutions in sequence. The kind where if you got the first one wrong, you didn't find out until the 3rd line. By which point everything had already collapsed. But was the kind of problem designed to humble you. But the thing nobody would have believed, the thing Elijah had stopped expecting anyone to believe, was that he could feel where it was going. Not just the answer, the path, the way the substitution would unfold, the way the variable would change shape, and the integral would simplify and the problem would narrow toward its conclusion, the way a river narrows before it reaches the sea. He wrote 3 lines, stopped, looked at the second one, erased it, wrote it differently, better. Outside, a car moved down the street below, then nothing, then the faint sound of the upstairs neighbor's television through the ceiling, then nothing again. Elijah kept writing. He had been doing this for almost a year. Not in the kitchen specifically. Sometimes at the library branch on Clement. Sometimes at the table by the window, in the small hours when Gerald was on a night job, and the apartment was entirely his. But always after midnight. Always quiet, always alone. He had a notebook, a spiral one he'd bought with his own money at the drugstore, and the pages were dense with his handwriting. Not messy, compressed. The particular handwriting of someone who thinks in small spaces and knows how to use them. He kept the notebook under the loose floorboard beneath his half of the bedroom, which was maybe overly dramatic, but he had his reasons. Not shame. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He wasn't ashamed of what he was doing, he was protecting it. There was a difference, a significant one. He finished the problem, read back through it, checked the substitution, checked the coefficient on the 3rd line. Found a small error, corrected it, read back through again. I was right. He put the pencil down, looked at the page. The solution sat there on the paper, neat and complete, asking nothing from him. He let himself feel good about it for exactly 1 minute. Then he hit page 214 and started the next one. At 12:47, the key turned in the front door. He heard the shoes come off in the entryway. His mother always took her shoes off at the door. Even when she was exhausted, even when her feet hurt from 11 hours on a hospital ward, she took them off because she refused to bring whatever the hospital floor held into the place where her children slept. He heard the soft shuffle of her socks moving through the hallway. The kitchen light was still on. Claudette Ossie appeared in the doorway. She looked at him, at the floor, at the textbook, at the notebook full of equations, at the pencil shavings he hadn't bothered to brush away, at the general evidence of a boy who had been sitting on a tile floor for several hours, doing things that were not in any way related to his 8th grade curriculum. She didn't say anything. She crossed to the light switch, turned it off, left the room. That was it. No questions. No, what are you doing? It's almost 1 in the morning. No, that doesn't look like homework for Miss Hale's class. Just the dark and the sound of her socks in the hallway and the quiet click of the bedroom door. Elijah sat in the dark for a moment. Then he turned on his phone flashlight and kept reading. His mother understood him in the specific way of people who are too tired for long conversations but not too tired to pay attention. She had been a nursing aide for 11 years. She had seen enough to know that when something keeps a person up past midnight, you don't interrupt it. Turn off the overhead lights so the neighbors don't see, and you let it run its course. And you trust that what you're looking at is real, even when you don't have words for it yet. She knew her son. She just didn't know how much there was to know. Nobody did. Gerald Ossie's hands were the first thing people noticed about him. Thick at the knuckles, calloused across the palm, stained in the creases with something that no amount of soap could reach. The particular residue of 19 years of construction work, of concrete and cut lumber, and the metal of scaffolding rails. He'd started at 23. He hadn't stopped since. He was not a man of many words. But the words he used, he chose carefully. Every Saturday morning, Gerald would unroll his measuring tape in whatever corner of the apartment needed attention that week. A gap under the bathroom door. A section of baseboard that had come loose. A wall he'd been meaning to replaster since the spring. He'd crouch down, stretch the tape, squint at the numbers the way he squinted at everything that required precision. And then, without looking up, he'd say it. Elijah, come here, not because he needed the help. Gerald Ossie had been doing this work since before Elijah was born. He didn't need a 13-year-old to help him measure a section of baseboard, but he called him anyway. How many boards you think we need for this section right here? Elijah would look, would measure with his eyes first, then his mind, account for the overlap, account for waste, account for the fact that the wall wasn't perfectly square, which it never was, which you had to accommodate for, or you'd end 3 inch short on the last board and have to make another trip to the hardware store. Then he'd give a number. Gerald would pull out his own figure, scratched on the back of a receipt, and compare them. 9 times out of 10 they matched. The 10th time, Elijah was right and Gerald had made an arithmetic error, which he corrected without comment and without embarrassment the way a man corrects himself, when the correction is more important than the ego. He never said, "You're good at this, son." He didn't need to. The way he nodded said it more clearly than words could. Gerald didn't know he was teaching his son mathematics on those Saturday mornings. He thought he was teaching Elijah to be useful, to be practical, to not be afraid of problems that had solutions if you looked at them long enough and carefully enough and without flinching, which, as it turned out, was the same thing, just without the textbook. Claudette came home at 12:47 most nights, sometimes later. She was a nursing aide at Riverside General, where the work was the kind that didn't end just because your shift did. You carried it with you in the elevator, and through the parking garage and all the way home, until sleep finally pulled it away from you for a few hours. She carried it quietly, the way she carried most things. She asked practical questions. She made practical decisions. She loved her children with a ferocity that expressed itself not in speeches but in actions so constant and unremarkable that they were almost invisible. She had seen the notebook. Not all of it. She wasn't the kind of mother who looked through things that belonged to her children. But she had seen the outside cover, and the edges of pages dense with symbols that were not 7th grade algebra. And she had made a calculation of her own. Her calculation said, whatever this is, it is not hurting him. It is, in fact, the only time he looks completely at peace. She left it alone. She turned off the light. She trusted what she saw. Miss Constance Hale had been teaching mathematics at Fairview Middle School for 27 years. This is the part of the story where it would be easy to say she was simply cruel. To draw the picture quickly, the cold teacher, the targeted student, the obvious villain. Stories move faster that way. They feel cleaner. But Constance Hale had not started out as someone who struck students with a ruler. She had started out as someone who loved mathematics. Not the performance of loving mathematics, not the professional affiliation of it, not the credential and the lesson plan and the end-of-year test scores. The actual love. The kind that surprises you, that shows up when you're 17 and fails every other subject, but keeps you up until 2 in the morning because you found something that makes sense in a world that mostly doesn't. She had been the first in her family to go to college. Mathematics education. She had walked into her first classroom at 27 with the particular energy of someone arriving exactly where they were supposed to be. She had been good. Her students remembered her. Former students came back years later and said things like, "Miss Hale is the reason I didn't drop out of engineering school. Miss Hale is the reason I applied to college at all." And then there was James Whitfield. James had been her student 15 years ago. 13 years old, quiet, the kind of mathematical intuition that showed up once in a career if you were lucky. She had staked her professional reputation on James, convinced the school board to allow him to sit for the state mathematics scholarship exam, a test meant for juniors and seniors, not for an 8th grader from her class. She had prepared him for months, stayed late, came in early, told anyone who would listen that this boy was exceptional. James sat for the exam on a February morning. The pressure broke him in the first 20 minutes. He froze at page 1 and never recovered. He finished with one of the lowest scores in the room. Hale had not fully recovered either. Not from the embarrassment. Not from the way the assistant principal had looked at her in the hallway the following week. The particular look of someone who has been right about your overreach and is too professional to say so out loud. Not from the 3 months of preparation that had ended in a conference room with a score she was not allowed to appeal. After James, she built something, brick by careful brick, a wall between who she had been and who she had decided to become. No more exceptions. No more this student is different. No more using her credibility as currency for a child who might collapse under pressure and take her reputation with them. She would teach the curriculum. She would enforce the method. She would grade what could be measured and stay inside the lines of what could be defended. And she would never again make the mistake of believing that a quiet boy with a gift was anything other than a risk wearing a promising face. This is what Elijah Osei walked into every morning at 9:15. Not a monster, a wound that had learned to run a classroom. Elijah had understood this faster than most adults in the building, though he didn't have words for it yet. He had spent the past 8 months running a quiet calculation. Every time he answered a question the way he actually understood the answer, intuitively, through a path that was shorter and more elegant than the one Hale had demonstrated. She marked him down. Not wrong exactly, not by the standard rule, but she had a way of noting method deviation in her feedback that carried enough weight to pull an A into a B and a B into a C-. So he learned to perform ignorance. He followed her steps like a recipe he'd already memorized. He showed his work in exactly the sequence she'd taught it, even when a different sequence would have gotten there in half the time. He got C-, consistent, unremarkable, invisible. He had watched what happened to a boy named Curtis the previous year. Curtis had corrected a long division error on the board, politely, genuinely, because the error would have confused the rest of the class, and had spent the following 4 months being called disrespectful. His seat had been moved to the back corner. He had transferred to Westbrook in January. Elijah had filed that information carefully, made his adjustments, C-, every time. It wasn't stupidity. It was survival mathematics, the kind with no formula and no textbook, the kind you learned by watching what happened to people who didn't do it. He had also, in the library catalog, 6 months before the events of that Tuesday morning, found an old faculty publication database. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been searching for supplementary materials on vector calculus, and the search had pulled up a staff paper from 1998. Structural Applications of Differential Geometry and Bridge and Road Design by C. Hale, Mathematics Department, Fairview Unified School District. He'd read it, slowly, carefully. The way he read everything that interested him. Was good. Better than good, actually. It was the work of someone who had understood what mathematics could do in the physical world, who had written about it with a precision and a passion that showed up in every paragraph. The Constance Hale who had written that paper had loved what she was talking about. He had thought about that a few times on the walk home from school. He had not told anyone. There was no reason to tell anyone. It was just something he knew. A small thing tucked away. Tuesday, 3rd week of November. The bus broke down on Clover Street at 8:47 in the morning. Not a metaphor, an actual bus. The driver announced engine trouble in the flat voice of someone who has made this announcement before and expects to make it again before the month is out. 40 students stood on the sidewalk in the thin fall cold and looked at their phones and calculated whether walking was faster than waiting. Elijah walked. He arrived at Fairview Middle School at 9:22, 7 minutes late. He knew, turning into the hallway toward room 14, that the morning had already decided what it was going to be. He could feel it the way you feel changes. Not in any single thing, but in everything at once, the texture of the air, the particular quality of the silence inside the door. He opened it. Miss Hale was at the board, back to the class, writing. She didn't turn around. Late again, Elijah. Not a question. Not an accusation, exactly. A fact stated the way you'd note a recurring malfunction. Yes, ma'am. The bus on Clover. Sit down. He hesitated. And here is where the morning fractured. Because sitting was not something Elijah could do this morning without consequences that would show. His back. Last Tuesday. At the board, he'd paused in the middle of a problem to check his work, which was the correct thing to do. Which was what every math teacher in the building would have told you was the correct thing to do. And Hale had decided the pause meant inattention. She had snapped the flat of the ruler across the back of his shoulders. Once, then twice. Then a third time when he didn't respond the way she wanted. He had pressed his lips together and stared at the board and made no sound. He had not told his parents. He had run the calculation. Gerald would come in. Gerald, who was not a man who spoke softly about things done to his children, would come in and say exactly what needed to be said, and Hale would file a response with HR describing an aggressive parent and an insubordinate student. And Marsh would sit across from Gerald and speak carefully about process and documentation and the importance of having both sides. And by the end of it, Elijah would be the troubled kid with the aggressive father. Nothing would have changed except the temperature in room 14. He had seen versions of that calculation play out for other kids. He was not going to let it happen to him. So he had said nothing, gone home, slept on his side for 4 nights. The bruising had moved from surface to muscle, the deep kind that aches when you shift your weight. Sitting would hurt. Standing very still at the back of the room would not. I can stand, he said. My back, your back. Hale turned from the board. Her expression was exactly what it always was, controlled, precise, the face of someone who had decided long ago which emotions were permitted in this room and which were not. Is that today's excuse? Scattered laughter from the desks. A few people who knew better than to laugh but did it anyway, because that's how rooms like this work. Cody Briggs, front row, center seat, made a sound in the back of his throat. The specific sound of a 13-year-old boy who has learned that making the teacher's target feel small is a form of social currency. Sit down, Hale said. I can't, Miss Hale. The room went still, not the ordinary quiet of a class waiting for instruction. Something else, held. Like a collective breath that 23 people had taken at the same moment and were now deciding whether to release. Hale looked at him. Really looked. The kind of look she hadn't given him in months, the kind that went past the C- and the absence of disruption and actually landed on him as a specific person in a specific room with a specific body. Something happened behind her eyes. Fast, private. Gone before anyone could name it. She turned back to the board, picked up the eraser, wiped the day's problem clean in 3 long strokes, picked up the marker, and wrote, not 8th grade algebra, not the problem they'd been working on. What she wrote was a calculus problem, AP level, the kind that lit her curriculum for juniors and seniors, who had been studying toward it for 2 years. Integration by substitution with a trigonometric component, 2 distinct substitutions required in sequence. She stepped back. This, she said, and her voice had gone pleasant in the way that said, Elijah's stomach dropping, is a problem from the 11th grade advanced placement course. She gestured toward the board with the marker. Since Elijah prefers to stand, perhaps he'd like to demonstrate for us while he's on his feet. Cody laughed, not the throat sound this time, a real laugh, short and sharp. A few more followed, then more. The room filling with the particular sound of people who are relieved the attention has landed somewhere other than them. Nadia Okonkwo, back corner, third seat from the window, did not laugh. She looked at her desk, pressed her thumbnail into the grain of the wood and did not look up. 5 minutes, Hale said, checking the clock. Or it's a week's detention. Elijah looked at the board. His heart was doing something loud, something that had nothing to do with calculus. But beneath it, beneath the noise of the room and the weight of 23 pairs of eyes, and the deep ache in his back when he shifted his weight, beneath all of that, something else was happening. Recognition. The problem on the board was not unfamiliar. He had worked through this exact type of integration 3 weeks ago on page 212 of the library textbook. He had made a mistake on the second substitution, identified it, understood why it was a mistake, and corrected his thinking. He had then worked 6 more problems of the same type until the pattern was not just familiar but instinctive. He knew this problem. He walked to the front of the room. The laughter faded. Not immediately, it tapered. The way sound tapers when people realize they're not sure anymore whether they're watching something funny. Cody stopped smiling. Hyle stepped aside, barely enough to make room, with the expression of someone extending a courtesy they fully expect to regret for nothing. Elijah picked up the marker. His right hand was steady. His back hurt with every small shift of his weight. He breathed through it, and he began. He did not use Hale's method. He couldn't. Not because he didn't know it, but because it wasn't the right tool for this particular problem. Her method worked, technically, but it required 3 extra steps to account for the trigonometric component, in a way that a cleaner approach could handle in one. He had found the cleaner approach in a footnote on page 209, a footnote the textbook author had included almost apologetically, as if they expected most teachers to skip it. His hand moved. First line. Second. The substitution unfolded the way it had in his notebook. The variable shifting, the integral simplifying, the path narrowing. The room was completely quiet, not polite quiet. Not the quiet of 23 people pretending to pay attention. The real kind. The involuntary kind. The kind that happens when something in the room has changed. No one has been told yet, but everyone can feel it. Cody's mouth was slightly open. He didn't know it. Nadia had looked up from her desk. She was watching Elijah's hand move across the board with the focused attention of someone watching a thing she wants to understand.
Fourth line.
Fifth. Elijah paused, not from uncertainty, from precision. He checked the substitution, underlined a coefficient, continued. Final steps. He drew a box around the answer, set the marker down, turned around. The silence lasted 4 full seconds, which is a genuinely long time when you're standing at the front of a room with 23 people looking at you. Long enough for a thought to form and dissolve, and be replaced by something that doesn't have a name yet. Hale crossed to the board, her heels on the tile, the sound of them very clear in the silence. She stopped in front of the solution and read it. Her eyes moved from the first line to the last, then back up, then to the third line, the substitution step, then the final answer. Something happened to her expression. Not a large thing, a small thing, a fraction of a shift in the architecture of her face. The controlled, measured face she had worn for 27 years. And it was gone almost before it happened, but it was there. She had recognized what she was looking at. She caught it, pulled the expression back, turned to face Elijah. Where did you copy this from? Her voice was quiet, quieter than the laughter had been, quieter than any moment since he'd come through the door late. I didn't copy it. That's not possible. I solved it. You memorized it. Someone gave you this problem in advance. The integration requires substitution, then the trigonometric. Enough. The word landed flat and hard. She crossed to the board in 2 steps and picked up the eraser and wiped the solution away. Completely fast. Gone. Then she reached for the notebook in Elijah's hand, the small green one he'd been using to jot working notes during the problem. And she pulled it from him and tore it in half, down the spine, the paper separating with a sound that seemed much louder than it should have. Both halves hit the floor. Principal's office. She's cheating. Subordination. Disrupting class. Elijah bent down and picked up his backpack from where he'd set it at the front of the room. He straightened slowly, carefully, managing his back. He turned toward the door. Mrs. Hale, a small voice, from the back corner. Third seat from the window. Nadia Okonkwo, who had said almost nothing in this classroom since October, who sat with her hood down. and her thumbnail pressing into the desk grain and her mouth in a careful flat line most days. 23 heads turned. What if he actually solved it? The temperature in the room dropped. Hale's gaze moved to Nadia and stayed there. It was not the same gaze she turned on Elijah. It was something quieter and more complete, the gaze of someone filing an infraction. Out, she said to Elijah. Now. He walked. As he passed Nadia's row, he felt rather than saw her hand move. Fast, low below the level of anyone's sightline. A small piece of paper pressed into his palm. He closed his fingers around it without looking at it. Kept walking. Through the door, into the hallway. The hallway outside room 14 was empty. Yellow linoleum. Fluorescent lights that hummed a half-step flat. A bulletin board with construction paper artwork from the 6th grade section. The edges curled and faded because nobody had changed it since early September. Elijah walked to the wooden bench outside the main office and sat down. The pain in his back when he sat was sharp and then dull. He shifted his weight lift, breathed. The office secretary, Mrs. Park, who had worked at Fairview for 11 years and had developed the particular administrative composure of someone who had seen everything at least twice, glanced at him over her reading glasses. Then back to her screen. Through the frosted glass door marked Principal Dale Marsh, Elijah could hear one voice. Hale's. The words blurred through the glass, but the shape of them was familiar. He didn't need to hear them clearly to fill in the details. He reached into his left jacket pocket, pulled out the piece of paper. He hadn't had a chance to look at it properly in the hallway. He looked at it now. A corner of notebook paper, torn at one edge and clean at the other. In his own handwriting, the small compressed handwriting he used for mathematics, different from his regular handwriting, the final 2 lines of the solution he'd written on the board. He had not dropped this. He had checked his pocket twice on the way out to make sure. Hadia had picked it up from the floor when the notebook halves fell. She must have moved fast, gotten low, gotten it before anyone noticed, and when he'd walked past her row, she'd pressed it into his palm, without looking at him, without slowing down, without making it visible. Here, take this. He folded it smaller, put it in his left breast pocket, against his chest. The only surviving writ of a truth someone had tried to erase. He sat there for 11 minutes. Then Principal Dale Marsh opened the frosted glass door. Marsh was 58 years old. Gray at the temples in the way that looked less like aging and more like a distinction he'd grown into. He had the eyes of a man who had been managing other people's conflicts for 20 years and had mostly stopped expecting mornings to go smoothly. Come in, Elijah. Elijah came in. Hale was already seated, straight-backed, hands folded, the precise postures of someone who has framed their account and is waiting to have it accepted. Marsh settled behind his desk, looked at Elijah the way he looked at most complicated situations, with the expression of a man trying to be fair to 2 versions of the same event. Huppins Hale has explained what happened. Do you have anything to say? I didn't cheat, Elijah said. I solved the problem. I can solve another one right now if you want. Hale made a small sound, not quite a laugh. I've been studying advanced mathematics on my own, Elijah said, for almost a year, at the library. Textbooks, online materials. I know calculus. What I wrote on that board was correct, and she erased it. He's barely passing my class, Hale said to Marsh before he could respond. C- consistently all year, suddenly solving AP-level calculus. She let the implication sit. The most charitable explanation is that someone gave him this specific problem in advance. And the less charitable explanation? Marsh asked. Hale didn't answer that. Marsh looked at Elijah, the look of a man who has worked in this building for 12 years and has learned that the path of least resistance is usually the path that doesn't require him to contradict a 27-year veteran teacher in her own disciplinary complaint. I'd like to suggest a formal evaluation, Elijah said. Supervised any calculus problem. I'll solve it in front of whoever you want. That's, Hale began.
3 sharp knocks at the door.
Not apologetic, not uncertain. The knock of someone who has already decided to come in. The door opened. Ms. Joanna Pruitt was 34 years old and taught 7th and 8th grade science in room 9. She had the particular energy of someone who drinks 1 cup of coffee and then operates at full speed for the rest of the day without needing another. She looked at the room, at Hale, at Elijah, at the detention slip on Marsh's desk. Is this about Elijah? Mrs. Pruitt, Hale said, this is a mathematics matter. I teach science, Pruitt said. Last fall, Elijah used differential equations to model plant growth patterns, equations that aren't part of our curriculum. Equations I had to look up afterward to fully verify. She looked at Marsh. He placed first in the mathematics application category at the district science fair. I have the documentation. Where's deal still? Why wasn't this brought to my attention? Marsh said. Elijah asked me not to make a big deal of it. Pruitt looked at Elijah directly. He doesn't like attention. I respected that, until today. Marsh set down the pen he'd been holding. Hale uncrossed her ankles, crossed them the other way. This doesn't explain the insubordination, she said. He refused a direct instruction to sit down. Actually, Pruitt said carefully, I'd like to understand that part too. She looked at Elijah. You're back. You mentioned it. Can you show us? This is Hale Startnard. Miss Hale. Marsh's voice was quiet in the way of someone who has just made a decision. Please. Elijah looked at Pruitt, at Marsh. Then he lifted the back of his shirt, just enough. The bruising across his lower back was visible. Not fresh, not open, but clear. The kind of mark that had a shape, a specific, unmistakable shape. Pruitt's breath caught. Marsh stood up from his desk. Hale's composure fractured. Not completely, but visibly. Those could have come from anywhere, she said. Her voice was not what it had been. A fall. A sports. Marsh said. The same quiet, more of it. I think you should wait outside. She stood, gathered her things with the deliberate, careful movements of someone managing something that had come apart faster than she had planned, walked to the door, and stopped. I've taught at this school for 27 years, she said without turning around. My record has never. I know your record, Constance, Marsh said. She left. The door closed. Marsh looked at Elijah, then at Pruitt. I owe you an apology, he said to Elijah. That's the first thing. He sat back down. The second thing is we're going to do exactly what you suggested. A formal evaluation supervised. Tomorrow morning, conference room B. Any problem we put in front of you, you solve it. He paused. Miss Hale will not be in the room. Elijah said nothing for a moment. Then, yes, sir. And your parents? I'm calling them this afternoon. Marsh's expression had shifted into something older and less official. The face under the administrator's face. This should have been caught sooner. That's on all of us. Elijah nodded. Outside in the hallway, Pruitt walked him to the side door. You have someone you trust, she said. For tonight, someone to talk to. He thought about the text he needed to send. Yes, he said. Good. She went back inside. Elijah pushed through the side door into the afternoon. The air was the specific temperature of November in this city. Not cold enough to need a real coat, but cold enough that you felt it. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building and let it settle on him. He reached into his jacket pocket, found his phone, pulled it out, texted the number saved under a professor's name. Something happened today. Test tomorrow. Important. The reply came in less than a minute. Library, 5 p.m. I'll be there. He put the phone away, looked up at the sky. The kind of sky that wasn't telling you anything, just wide. Was there. He touched his left breast pocket once briefly, his fingers resting on the small folded square of paper. The solution was still in his head. All of it. Complete and intact. They could erase the board. They could tear the notebook. They could do whatever they needed to do to the evidence. But the mathematics lived in him. And tomorrow, in a room where nobody could take it away, he was going to write it down again. Every single line. The library on Clement Street closed at 9. Dr. Aubrey Weston was always there before Elijah arrived. This had been true for 6 months. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the professor would be at the corner table by the periodicals shelf, the one with the wobbling leg that everyone avoided except him, 2 cups of vending machine coffee on the table, and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and whatever he'd been working on spread out in front of him. He was 61 years old, and he moved with the particular unhurriedness of someone who had stopped performing urgency a long time ago. Elijah pushed through the library door at 5:08. Weston looked up. Read him immediately. Sit down, he said. Tell me. Elijah sat, told him, all of it. The bus, the late arrival, the ruler, which he hadn't mentioned to Weston before, which came out now without planning, because the day had stripped away whatever he'd been using to keep it separate. The problem on the board, the silence in the room, the 4 seconds after he turned around, Hale's face when she looked at his solution, the eraser, the notebook in 2 pieces on the floor. Weston listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that was different from most adults Elijah had encountered. Not the listening that was really waiting to respond. Not the kind that rearranged itself into advice before you'd finished the sentence. He just listened, let the whole thing come. When Elijah finished, the library was quiet around them. A woman was returning books at the front desk. Somewhere in the stacks, a child was asking a question Elijah couldn't make out. Weston looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "Show me the problem." Elijah picked up a pencil from the table. Weston always brought pencils. This had been true since the first day, and turned to a clean page in the spiral notebook he carried for their sessions. He wrote the problem from memory, all of it, exactly as Hale had written it on the board. Weston looked at it.
And your solution?
Elijah wrote that too. The full solution, both substitutions, every step, the way he'd written it on the board before the eraser took it. Weston read through it carefully. He adjusted his glasses. "Read it again." "Elegant," he said. "The second substitution. That's not the standard approach." "It's in the footnote on page 209, Elijah said. "The textbook author calls it a more elegant method for trigonometric components." "I know the footnote." Weston set the notebook down. "Most teachers skip it. It requires the student to recognize the structure before the substitution, rather than after. It asks more of the person solving it." He looked at Elijah. "She saw this on the board?" "Yes, and she knew it was correct. It wasn't a question." But Elijah answered it anyway. She looked at it for a long time before she erased it. Weston was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing he'd been building toward, the thing Elijah could feel coming from the way the pause had a shape to it. "I need to tell you something. I should have told you sooner." He picked up his coffee, set it back down without drinking. 30 years ago, I had a student. His name was Michael Strand. He was 16, which means this was 1994, which means I had been teaching for less than 2 years and had not yet learned the lesson I should have already known. He looked at the table. Michael was. There are students you teach, and then there are students who show you the shape of what mathematics is actually for. Michael was the second kind. He thought in 3 dimensions when the problem was 1-dimensional. He could see the structure of a thing before he touched it. Elijah said nothing. He understood without being told that this was the kind of story you didn't interrupt. "I believed in him," Weston said, "but I didn't advocate for him. There's a difference. Believing is private. Advocating is public and uncomfortable, and requires you to put something on the line." He turned the coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "I believed in Michael privately and did nothing publicly, and by the time I understood what that meant, he had been failed by enough of the system that he didn't want to try anymore. He left school at 16. I tried to find him over the years. I never did." The periodicals shelf behind them held newspapers in plastic sleeves. The light from the windows was going orange, which meant it was almost 6. "I'm telling you this," Weston said, "because tomorrow morning you are going to walk into a room and demonstrate something that most people in that building will not have expected from you. And you need to know, before you go in, that what you know cannot be taken from you by the result of that test. No matter what happens in that room, the mathematics is yours. Hale didn't give it to you. Marsh can't invalidate it. The test is for them, not for you." He picked up his glasses, folded them, set them on the table. "But the test matters anyway, because what happens afterward matters, and I want to be there when it does. I'd come to the school. I'd come to the school." He said it simply, without drama. "That's what mentors do. We don't just teach, we show up." Elijah looked at the problem on the open notebook page, his handwriting, his solution. "I'm scared," he said. He said it the way you say a true thing when the space is finally large enough to hold it. Not of the math. Of what happens if I do everything right and they still don't. If they find a way to. "Then we try again," Weston said, differently. "But let's not get there yet." He picked up his pencil. "Let's talk about what you know, not what you've memorized, what you actually understand. Because understanding is what they can't argue with." They worked until the library's closing announcement came over the speakers at 8:45. Not drilling problems. Not reviewing formulas. Weston asked him to explain concepts, to articulate why the second substitution worked, why the trigonometric form required a different approach, what the integration was actually describing in geometric terms. He pushed on the explanations, found the edges of what Elijah understood and helped him see past them. By the time they packed up, Elijah could have explained his solution to anyone in any order from any starting point. That was the point. At the door, Weston paused. Get some sleep, he said. Real sleep. Not 2 hours on the kitchen floor. Elijah almost smiled. Yes, sir. He walked home in the November dark. His breath made small clouds. The street was quiet in the particular way of a Tuesday evening in a working neighborhood. People home from their shifts and not yet out again. He thought about Michael Strand. 1994. 16 years old. A mind that could see the structure of things before it touched them. He wondered if Michael had ever found his way back to mathematics. If the thing that was native to you, the thing that was in you, the way a language is in you before you learn its name, could be taken from you by enough years of being told it wasn't there. He didn't think it could. He touched the left breast pocket of his jacket, the folded paper. He didn't think you could lose what lived in you that deep. He went home, made rice, checked on Tania, who was doing homework at the kitchen table and didn't look up. Watched television with his mother for 40 minutes without seeing A of it. Went to bed at 10. He did not sleep until after midnight, but when he slept through. Gerald Osei got the call at 3:17 in the afternoon on a job site in the warehouse district, up on the 4th level of scaffolding with a level in his hand and a section of exterior framing that needed to be true before end of day. He climbed down. He stood on the ground floor and listened to Principal Marsh's voice on the phone. His face during this was not readable in the way that most people's faces are readable. Gerald had spent 20 years being the only black foreman on job sites where people watched how he responded to things, and he had developed a face for being watched. Still, composed. Whatever he was actually thinking, it did not arrive on his face until he had decided to let it, he said. I'll have my wife call you back within the hour. She'll be finishing her shift at 4. He hung up. He called Claudette. She was not finishing her shift at 4. She was finishing at 4:30. But she left at 3:50 and called Marsh from the car and spoke to him in the particular voice she used when she was exercising maximum control over a maximum amount of feeling, which was the voice she used in hospitals when the news was bad and the patient needed someone calm. They arrived at the school together at 5:15. Marsh's office felt smaller with Gerald in it. Not because Gerald was physically imposing, though he was. Because of what he brought into the room with him. The weight of a man who had been waiting for a long time to be in exactly this kind of room, and had rehearsed, in some version of himself, what he was going to say. I waited until Marsh finished explaining. Then he put both hands flat on the desk, not as a threat, as a way of anchoring himself. Let me make sure I understand, he said. My son has been struck by this teacher. More than once. He didn't tell us because he calculated that telling us would make things worse for him. And he calculated correctly. Based on how this kind of thing tends to go. I paused. What I need you to hear is that my son ran a more sophisticated institutional analysis than most adults I know. At 13, because he had to. Marsh looked at the desk. He taught himself college-level mathematics in secret. Gerald continued, because he didn't believe anyone in this building would respond to it the way it deserved. And based on what happened yesterday, he was right about that too. Another pause. So before we talk about what happened, I need you to understand what you're looking at. You're not looking at a student who acted out. You're looking at a student who was correct about every calculation he made, in a building where being correct wasn't enough to protect him. Claudette, beside him, said nothing. Was he looking Marsh with the particular attention of a woman who has worked in medical settings long enough to know the difference between someone who is listening and someone who is managing you. She was determining which one Marsh was. Marsh, to his credit, was listening. The teacher has been placed on administratively pending investigation, he said. That began this morning. The school nurse has documented the injuries. We're following the required reporting protocol. He looked at Gerald. I should have. There were signs. The grade discrepancy alone should have prompted a review. I didn't ask the right questions. And I'm not going to tell you that what happened is excusable because I was deferring to a veteran teacher. It's not excusable. Gerald sat back. Claudette said, for the first time, what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow morning, Elijah sits a supervised evaluation. Mathematics from 8th grade level through advanced placement calculus. Proctored by me and Miss Pruitt. No one else in the room. Marsh slid a folder across the desk. And after that, depending on results, we'll be discussing an academic development plan that actually reflects what your son can do. Claudette opened the folder. She read it. The plan was 3 pages. It had been drafted, Marsh Jones explained, with significant input from Aubrey West, and who had contacted the school that morning and whose qualifications, 6 pages attached at the back, were not easy to argue with. Claudette read through it twice. Advanced mathematics classes at Jefferson High, she said. 3 mornings a week. Starting January, Marsh said. If Elijah agrees. Continued mentorship with Dr. Weston. Formalized. With the district's cooperation and funding. She looked at Gerald. He was looking at the plan with an expression that had finally let something through. Not much. A fraction. The fraction that belonged to a father, reading a document that said his son's mind was going to be given room to become what it actually was. He picked up at the pen from Marsh's desk and signed where Marsh indicated. Conference room B was on the 2nd floor down the hall from the library. It was not a prestigious room. It had a water stain on the ceiling tile, a projector that required coaxing, and chairs that had been surplus from the district office sometime in the previous decade. Nobody held important meetings in Conference Room B. It was where you put things when the real conference rooms were taken. Elijah arrived at 7:22. Pruitt was outside the door. "How are you feeling?" she said. "I'm okay." She looked at him the way people look when they want the real answer. "I'm nervous," he said. "Not about the math." "I know," she said. "That kind of nervous is different." She pushed the door open. Marsh was at the table. A sealed envelope in the center of the table, a legal pad, and a set of sharpened pencils. The projector was on for no clear reason, aimed at the blank wall. The water stain on the ceiling tile looked, from this angle, almost like a tree. "Good morning, Elijah." Marsh's voice more formal than yesterday's, the voice of a procedure beginning. "Before we start, I want to be clear about the format. Inside this envelope are mathematics problems, ranging from 8th grade algebra through advanced placement calculus. You'll have 2 hours to complete as many as you can. I'll be in the room. Miss Pruitt will be outside." He paused. "Mrs. Hale prepared the problems. I reviewed them to ensure they were appropriate and fair." He said this without elaboration. Elijah said nothing. He sat down, set his backpack on the floor, pulled his chair in. Marsh broke the seal on the envelope, placed the test on the table in front of Elijah, a calculator to the left, pencils to the right. "You may begin whenever you're ready." Marsh sat at the far end of the table and opened his own notebook. Elijah looked at the first problem. 8th grade algebra. Standard. The kind of problem he could solve in approximately 45 seconds if he was being careful and 30 if he wasn't. He was careful. He worked through the first page in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I knew because he tracked time without meaning to. The same part of his brain that recognized mathematical structure also kept time without being asked. The second page was more complex algebra, one trigonometry problem at the end, 6 minutes. The third page was pre-calculus, 9 minutes and change. He stopped before the fourth page. He put his pencil down. He reached up and touched the left breast pocket of his jacket, the folded square of paper. He didn't take it out, just rested his fingers on it for a moment. Nadia's handwriting had not been on the paper. It was his own handwriting, his own solution, the piece that had survived. She had seen it fall from the torn notebook, and she had picked it up, and she had given it back to him without being asked, and without making it a thing that drew attention. Thought about that for a second. Then he picked up his pencil and turned to page 4. The calculus problems were arranged in order of increasing complexity. The first 2 were standard AP curriculum, the kind of problem that would appear on the exam in the spring, that had been worked through in classrooms across the country. He solved them using the approach he'd practiced with Weston. Not the fastest possible approach, the most complete one. The one that showed every step in a clear and defensible sequence. The third problem was harder. It was the kind of problem Hale would have had to look up, which told him something about where she'd gotten it. Not from her own curriculum, from somewhere else. It was also, he realized midway through the second step, the kind of problem that had 3 possible solution paths. And the one she was expecting him to use was the most circuitous one. He used a different one. He showed both. At the bottom of the page, in small, neat writing, he noted which approach he'd used first and why, and then demonstrated the standard approach as an alternative. Not to show off. Because if someone was going to argue with his method, he wanted the argument to be on the record before they made it. He worked through the final 2 problems. He put the pencil down. He looked at the page. He looked at Marsh. "I'm finished," he said. Marsh looked up from his notebook, looked at the clock on the wall. 38 minutes had passed. Marsh looked at the clock again as if a second look would change what it said. He stopped. Started again. The full test? Yes. I also wrote up alternative solutions for problems 3 and 5 on the last page, if that's helpful. Marsh stood up. He crossed to the table, looked at the test without touching it. Read the last page, turned to the page before it. Read. I'm going to step out for a moment, he said. His voice was doing something careful. Please wait here. He left. Elijah sat in conference room B with the water stain on the ceiling and the projector casting light on the blank wall and the pencils lined up beside the legal pad. He was not nervous anymore. He was something else. Not the opposite of nervous, something adjacent to it. The feeling of having put something real into the world and knowing that whatever happened to it next was not entirely in his hands. Outside in the hallway, he could hear Marsh's voice and then another voice, Pruitt's, then a pause, then a different voice, older, a voice he recognized. He exhaled. Outside the hallway window, the morning was gray and flat and ordinary. A pigeon was doing something on the window ledge that pigeons do when they've decided a ledge belongs to them. A car alarm went off somewhere and then stopped. The door opened. Marsh came in first, Pruitt behind him, and behind Pruitt, Dr. Aubrey Weston, in his coat and his slightly pushed-up reading glasses, looking at the room and then at Elijah, with the expression of someone who has arrived, prepared for several possible versions of this moment. I took the liberty, Pruitt said to Elijah. I know, Elijah said. Thank you. Marsh placed the test in front of Weston's. Weston sat down. Read. He read carefully. The way he read everything, not fast, not slow, with the patient thoroughness of someone who knew that the answer was in the work, and the work deserved full attention. On the third calculus problem, he stopped, looked at the alternative solution path. You showed both approaches, he said, in case there was a question about the first one. Weston looked up at him. Something in his face that Elijah had learned to recognize. Not surprise, but recognition. The look of someone who has seen a thing they knew existed, but had not yet been able to point to. There's no question about the first one, Weston said. He set the test down. He looked at Marsh. In 30 years of teaching graduate and undergraduate mathematics, I have administered evaluations to hundreds of students. The work in this test is equivalent to what I would expect from a strong second-year undergraduate mathematics major. He adjusted his glasses. There is no ambiguity here. I am happy to put that in writing, with my institutional affiliation, for any record you need to create. Marsh looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the ceiling. I owe this student an apology, Marsh said. He was looking at Elijah. I owe his parents an apology. The school has failed him at multiple levels, and I was one of those levels. I need you to know that I understand that. He paused. And I need to know if you're willing, let us do something about it. Elijah thought about the kitchen floor. The textbook with its overdue date stamp. The C-minuses he'd manufactured to stay invisible. The notebook in 2 pieces on the floor of room 14. He thought about Gerald on the scaffolding, coming down with a level still in his hand to take a phone call. He thought about Claudette, reading 3 pages of a plan someone had finally bothered to write. Yes, he said, Cody Briggs found him at lunch. This required a small amount of courage from Cody, because Elijah was sitting at his usual table, alone at the end, the seat where you put your shuffle when you wanted to be close to the wall and far from the noise. And approaching him there required crossing the visible territory of the cafeteria in a direction that could be read. Cody crossed it anyway. He sat down across from Elijah without asking, put his tray on the table, looked at it for a moment, then looked up. I took a photo, he said, when you were writing on the board, before she erased it. He pulled out his phone. The photo was blurry, taken at an angle, from the front row, with the fluorescent light creating a glare across part of the board. But you could see the structure. You could see the lines of the solution. You could see that there was a solution, complete, in Elijah's handwriting on the board before the eraser came. Elijah looked at it. I texted it to myself right away, Cody said. Before I thought about it, I wasn't planning to do anything with it. He stopped. Started again. I was sitting right there. First row. I could see everything. That's another stop. I watched you solve it without looking anywhere. No phone, no paper, just the board. And then I knew I knew what I was looking at. And she wasn't like this. He stopped. Elijah waited. I laughed, Cody said, this morning. and she put the problem up. I laughed at you. Elijah looked at him, at the blurry photo on the phone, at Cody's face, which was doing something uncomfortable and unpolished, the expression of someone who has not yet figured out how to wear their own conscience, but it's trying. I know, Elijah said. Cody nodded. One short nod. He picked up his phone, put it in his pocket, picked up his fork. I'm going to give the photo to Marcia's office, he said. Not a question. Okay, Elijah said. Okay, Cody said. He ate his lunch. He didn't apologize again. He didn't ask Elijah to perform from a version of forgiveness that would make him feel better. He just sat there and ate in the territory of someone he had spent months treating badly, and let that be what it was. Elijah ate his lunch too. It was not comfortable, but it was honest in a way that comfortable rarely is. After a while, without planning it, Elijah said, "It's a calculus problem. If you want to understand what it actually was." Cody looked at him. "I'm not going to understand it," Cody said. "You might," Elijah said. "The concept isn't that hard. It's the notation that looks worse than it is." Cody considered this. "Okay," he said. Elijah borrowed a napkin from the dispenser and a pen from his pocket and started explaining what integration by substitution actually meant, in terms that had nothing to do with the symbols on the board and everything to do with what the symbols were describing. Cody listened. He asked 2 questions. Both of them were the right questions. Not the questions you asked to seem like you were following, but the questions you asked when you were actually following and something didn't connect yet. The bell rang before they finished. "Can we?" Cody started. "Tomorrow," Elijah said. "Yeah," Cody said. "Tomorrow." He picked up his tray. Elijah sat for a moment in the empty cafeteria. The lunch staff was wiping down tables. A mop bucket moved somewhere near the kitchen entrance. He thought about the fact that he had just voluntarily explained calculus concepts to the person who had laughed at him yesterday. He thought about the fact that this was not as strange as it should have been. The school board meeting was held on Thursday evening in the district conference room. The room was full by 6:30, half an hour before the meeting began. Word had moved the way word moves when something real has happened. Not announced, not organized, just transmitted from person to person through the specific networks of a school community. Parents who had received the district notification email. Parents who had heard from their children. Teachers who had worked alongside Constance Hale for years and were sitting with something uncomfortable. Community members who had seen the brief news segment that ran Wednesday evening, just long enough to establish a fact pattern without resolution. The OC family arrived at 6:45. Gerald in the suit he kept for occasions when being dismissed was not an option. Claudette in her work clothes because she'd come directly from Riverside General, and there hadn't been time to change, and she had decided that was fine, that showing up mattered more than what she was wearing. Elijah between them. Anaya staying with a neighbor because some rooms are not for 9-year-olds, and this was one of them. Dr. Weston was already seated when they arrived. He'd saved them seats in the second row. He stood when he saw them, shook Gerald's hand, nodded to Claudette, and looked at Elijah for a moment without saying anything. Then he sat back down. Pruitt was there, 3 rows back, with 2 other teachers from Fairview. At the far end of the first row, separate, with the particular separateness of someone who has arrived somewhere they are no longer sure they belong, was a woman Elijah recognized. Older, gray at the temples, sitting very straight. Constance Hale. She had come. Elijah looked at her. She did not look at him. She was looking at the front of the room, at the 5 board members arranging their materials, with the expression of someone who has decided that presence is the only remaining form of dignity available to them. The meeting came to order at 7:02. Board President Eleanor Washington, 60 years old, former principal, currently in her 3rd term on the district board, ran through the formal agenda items in 12 minutes, and then set aside the prepared agenda. "Tonight's primary matter is a serious one," she said. "I want to be clear from the outset that this board does not hold these meetings to perform accountability. We hold them because the community has a right to understand what happened and what we intend to do about it." She looked at the room. On Tuesday of this week, a student at Fairview Middle School was publicly humiliated by a teacher who put an advanced placement calculus problem on the board with the explicit intention of demonstrating that the student would fail to solve it. The student solved it. The teacher erased the solution, accused the student of cheating, and sent him to the principal's office. A pause. We have also confirmed that this student had sustained physical injuries at the hands of the same teacher. Injuries he did not report because he correctly understood that reporting them would worsen his situation rather than improve it. The room was quiet. What I'd like the community to hear first, Washington said, is from the student himself. Elijah, would you be willing to speak? Elijah had not known this was going to be asked. Pruitt had mentioned there would be community comments. She hadn't mentioned this. He looked at Gerald. Gerald said nothing. He didn't nod or shake his head. He just looked back at Elijah, in the particular way of a father who understands that some decisions belong to his son, and this was one of them. Elijah stood up. He walked to the microphone. He looked at the room, at the board members, at the parents and teachers and community members who fully arose, at Gerald and Claudette, at Weston, who was watching him with an expression that was not encouragement or pressure but simply presence. He looked at Constance Hale. She was looking back at him now. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at the microphone and said, I want to say two things. The first is about what happened on Tuesday. The second is about something else. He said the first thing. He described what happened in room 14 in factual terms. The problem on the board, the solution, the erasure, the torn notebook. He didn't editorialize. He didn't perform distress. He described what happened the way he described a mathematical problem, with precision and in sequence. Then he said the second thing. My father taught me that mathematics is the language of the universe, that numbers don't bend to what people want them to mean. They just mean what they mean. I've been thinking about that a lot this week. He paused. What I want people in this room to understand is that what happened to me on Tuesday could have happened differently at any point in the last year. Someone could have asked a question. Someone could have noticed a discrepancy between what a student could actually do and what his transcript said. The system has tools for that. Fairview has tools for that. They weren't used. Another pause. That's not a complaint. It's a description. And it applies to other students who aren't in this room tonight. Students who calculated the way I calculated. That being seen was more dangerous than being invisible. He looked at the board. That calculation shouldn't be available to a 13-year-old. It should be so obviously wrong that no kid would think to make it. That's what I hope comes out of this. He walked back to his seat. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Cody Briggs stood up in the middle rows. He was holding a printed copy of the photo he'd taken, the blurry image of the board, the solution visible in Elijah's handwriting, time-stamped 9:31 a.m. on Tuesday. He walked it to the front and handed it to Board President Washington. I took this, he said. I was in the front row. I watched him solve it. I laughed when she put the problem up. He looked at the board. I'm saying that on the record because I think the record should have someone in it who was wrong and knows it. He went back to his seat. Nadia's letter was read by Pruitt, who had received it that morning. Nadia had submitted it in writing, 2 handwritten pages, because she wanted it to be exactly right and she was going to be in the room, and she wasn't sure she could say it without the paper. Pruitt read it straight through. It described what Nadia had observed in room 14 over the course of the school year. It was specific. It was dated. It was quiet and devastating in the way that precise documentation of ongoing harm always is. Then Weston spoke. He did not speak about Yelchel's test results, which he had already submitted in writing to the board. He spoke about Michael Strand. He told the story the way he'd told it to Elijah in the library, without drama, without embellishment, in the voice of someone for whom this story had become more true over the 30 years since it happened, not less. A student in 1994. A mind that saw structure before it was named. A system that didn't have room for him. A decision not to advocate. A boy who left school at 16 and whom Weston had spent 3 decades trying to find and never did. The room was very still. I am not here to suggest that what happened to Elijah Osei is the same as what happened to Michael Strand, Weston said. It isn't. Elijah's story has so far a different shape. I am here because the mechanism is the same. A student whose abilities do not fit the available categories. A system that responds to the misfit by questioning the student rather than expanding the categories. And adults who believe in the student privately and advocate publicly, only when the situation has already become a crisis. He looked at the board. I have submitted a formal proposal for a district-wide gifted identification protocol that does not rely on classroom grades as the primary indicator. I would be grateful if the board would review it before the December session. Washington said, "We will." The board's decisions were announced at 8:34. Constance Hale's employment was terminated effective immediately. The physical discipline incidents had been referred to the state licensing board with a recommendation for credential review. The district acknowledged institutional failure in multiple areas and committed to specific reforms. Sustained the Strand-Whitfield Exceptional Abilities Program to be piloted at Fairview and expanded district-wide if results warranted. Named for Michael Strand and James Whitfield, the student Hale had lost, and the student Weston had lost. 2 names. 2 stories of a system that had failed to expand when expansion was required. The program would identify students with demonstrated ability outside standard classroom metrics. It would provide accelerated pathways without requiring grade-based qualification. It would be free. Weston sat completely still when the name was announced. For a long moment, he didn't move at all. Gerald reached over and put his hand on the professor's arm, just briefly. Weston looked at him. Gerald nodded. Nothing was said. Some things don't need to be. Elijah watched this exchange and stored it somewhere in himself. The specific image of these young men, one who had built things with his hands for 20 years and one who had built things with his mind for 30, sitting next to each other in a school board meeting on a Thursday night in November, and understanding each other completely in the space of a nod. He was going to think about that image for a long time. He already knew it. The parking lot behind Fairview Middle School was empty at 8:47 on a Friday morning. Not completely empty. 2 cars near the staff entrance, a maintenance truck with its hazard lights going, a pigeon doing something determined near the dumpster enclosure. But the student drop-off area was clear, and the visitor spaces were clear, and the long row of angled spots along the back fence had nothing in them except the particular November light that comes low and sideways and makes ordinary things look like they're being filmed. Constance Hale's car was in the 3rd spot from the end. She was still in it. She had been in it for 22 minutes. She knew because she'd been watching the clock on the dashboard with the specific attention of someone who has run out of other things to do. She had driven here without planning to. She had left her apartment at 8:15 with a box of items she needed to collect from her classroom. The personal things. The photograph of her mother on the corner of the desk, the mug she'd been using for 11 years, the small succulent she'd kept alive through 2 building renovations and 1 broken heating system. And she had driven the route she had driven for 27 years and ended up in the parking lot. She had not gotten out. The box was on the passenger seat. She was 54 years old. She had been a teacher for 27 of those years. She had been, for most of those years, genuinely good. She had a drawer at home with cards from former students. Not many. She was not the kind of teacher who inspired a gratitude that produced, but some. Enough. A card from a girl who had failed her class twice before passing on the 3rd attempt and had written, "You never treated me like I was stupid," which had seemed like a low bar at the time and now seemed like the whole point. She had struck a student with a ruler, not once. Odd in a moment of lost control that she could blame on circumstances. 3 times across the same week, with enough consistency to constitute a pattern. She had known it was wrong while she was doing it. She had known it the way you know something you've decided not to think about. The knowledge present but unpermitted, living in the room behind the room where you were standing. She had also looked at Elijah Osie's solution on the board and known, in the first seconds, that it was correct. Not just correct, better than correct. The particular elegance of someone who had understood the structure of the problem before they touched it, who had found the path that the footnote described and used it naturally, the way you use something that belongs to you. She had recognized that, and she had erased it anyway. She sat in the car and let that be true. A knock on the passenger window, she turned. Dr. Aubrey Weston was standing outside the car. I had his coat on. The old one he'd been wearing since she'd first seen him at a district mathematics symposium 8 years ago, and his reading glasses were pushed up on his forehead, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not triumphant, and not sympathetic, not accusatory. Just present. She almost didn't open the door. She opened it. He sat down in the passenger seat next to the box of her things and pulled the door closed. The car was warm. Outside the parking lot stayed empty. I didn't expect you to be here, she said. I know. Are you here too? No, he said. I'm not here to do anything except talk if you want to. You can tell me to leave. She looked at the dashboard clock. 8:53. I came to get my things, she said. I've been sitting here for half an hour. I know. I saw you pull in. She looked at him. I was walking from the staff entrance, he said. I had a meeting with Marsh about the program logistics. I saw your car. She looked back at the clock. Why did you stay? She said. Not a question exactly. Because you're still here, he said. And I thought that might mean something. The pigeon near the dumpster had found whatever it was looking for. Flew off. The maintenance truck's hazard lights kept going. Regular and indifferent. I knew, she said. When I looked at the board, I knew immediately, yes, and I erased it. Yes, that's the part she stopped. The part she what? The part she couldn't get past. The part she'd been sitting in this parking lot with for 22 minutes. 25 now. I have spent 15 years building a very specific position on what talent looks like, where it comes from, what it requires. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. I believed in a student once, completely. I put everything I had behind that belief, and it cost me more than I knew I had to lose. James Whitfield, Weston said. She looked at him. He came to my department's open house last spring, Weston said. He's finishing his master's degree in applied mathematics. At 32. He took a long road. He paused. He asked about you. The clock said 8:06. He asked if you were still teaching, Weston said. I told him yes. He stopped. Started again. He said you were the first person who told him that what he could do was real. That it took him a long time to believe it again after the exam. But that he always remembered that you'd said it. Constance Hale was not someone who cried easily. She had not cried in a school context in 19 years. Which was long enough ago that she had stopped thinking of it as suppression and had started thinking of it as simply the way she was built. She was not going to cry in her car in the parking lot at 8:56 on a Friday morning. She pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. I spent 15 years deciding that what I saw in him was the exception, she said. That it had been a mistake to trust it. And then Elijah O.C. walked into my classroom and I saw the same thing and I didn't want to see it. And I made sure I didn't have to. She looked out the windshield at the empty parking lot. That's not a complicated story. It's a very simple story about someone who was afraid and decided that a child should carry the cost of that. Weston said nothing. I hit him, she said, 3 times, with a ruler, because he paused at the board and I decided the pause was insolence and I. She stopped. There is no version of that sentence that ends correctly. No, Weston said, there isn't. The clock said 8:59. James asked about me, she said. She was quiet for a moment. When you see him, she said. Tell him. She stopped. Started again. Tell him I'm glad he took the long road. Weston nodded. He opened the passenger door. Got out. Stood for a moment with the door open, letting the cold air in. The box, he said. I'll carry it to the office if you want. She looked at the box on the seat. The photograph of her mother. The mug. The succulent that had survived 2 renovations. No, she said. I'll get it. She got out of the car. They walked to the staff entrance together. She carried the box. He held the door. Inside, she went to the office to sign the forms that needed signing. He went to his meeting with Marsh. On the hallway where their paths divided, they didn't say anything to each other. There wasn't anything left to say that the parking lot hadn't already held. She signed the forms. She took her box. She walked out through the main entrance for the last time. The morning was cold and ordinary and fully itself. The week after the board meeting, 3 things happened that individually meant something, and together meant more. The first was that Jefferson High School's mathematics department chair called Principal Marsh to confirm enrollment logistics for the spring semester. Elijah O.C. would begin attending advanced mathematics class at Jefferson 3 mornings a week starting in January. Not as a novelty, not as an experiment. As a student whose placement had been assessed, and whose level had been established, and who was being given the appropriate room to work in. The second was that the district's Human Resource Department received 14 formal complaints from and former Fairview students regarding Ms. Hale's classroom conduct, submitted in the 2 weeks following the board meeting. Most of them described variations on what Elijah had experienced, the particular texture of being managed rather than taught, the grade penalties for using methods that worked but weren't hers. 3 described physical incidents. None of the 14 had spoken up at the time for the same reason Elijah hadn't. Each complaint used different words to describe the same calculation. The cost of speaking was higher than the cost of enduring. The third thing was smaller and larger at the same time. Nadia Okonkwo started talking in class, not performing, not raising her hand constantly or trying to recover some lost ground, just participating, asking questions when she had them, answering when she knew the answer, offering a different approach when she saw one. Her new teacher, Mr. Diaz, who had been brought in as a long-term substitute while the district conducted a full search for a permanent hire, had the particular skill of some young teachers who haven't yet learned to be threatened by students who think differently. He received Nadia's contributions the way they deserved to be received, with interest, with follow-up questions, with the implicit message that her thinking had value in this room. She wrote a piece for the school newspaper, the first issue of the spring semester, which went up on the school's website in late January. The headline was, "The Boy Who Was Always There." It described what she had seen in room 14 on that Tuesday morning in November. It described the solution on the board. It described the 4 seconds of silence. It described the moment she had picked up the torn piece of paper from the floor. She sent Elijah a copy before it ran. He read it in the library at Jefferson High between his calculus session and the walk back to Fairview for afternoon classes. He read it twice, then he texted her, "This is good. You should keep writing." She texted back, "I know." He almost smiled at that. He put his phone away. He had a problem set to finish before dinner. The conversation with Weston that Elijah kept coming back to was not the one in the library the night before the test, though that one mattered. It was a shorter one, from a Tuesday session in late January, 3 weeks into the Jefferson program. They were working through a problem in multivariable calculus, material from Weston's own first-year undergraduate course, which he had assigned not as a test, but because it was the next natural step, and there was no reason to hold it back. Elijah had gotten most of it. The geometric visualization of the third variable had given him trouble, which was not surprising because it gave most people trouble, because the human brain was not naturally configured to see in 4 dimensions. He described his difficulty to Weston, the specific place where his intuition ran out. Weston had said, "Good. That's the right place to get stuck." Elijah had looked at him. "The place where your intuition runs out," Weston said, "is the place where mathematics begins to require something more than pattern recognition. I have extraordinary pattern recognition, you always will. But mathematics at the level you're heading toward also requires you to build intuitions you don't have yet. To extend yourself into a space where you can't see clearly and stay there long enough for the seeing to develop." He paused. "That's not a problem with your ability. It's the beginning of your actual education." Elijah had sat with that. I sat with it again now, on a Thursday evening in February, on the kitchen floor where he'd started all of this, with the library's newest acquisition open in front of him. A graduate-level text on differential geometry that Wes had flagged as preparatory reading for the summer program application, and the textbook from last September in the stack beside it. The one he'd returned 3 months ago and rechecked out because he still wanted to have it near. The kitchen light buzzed overhead. Yellow, tired, the same light it had always been. He heard the key in the front door. Gerald, back from a job that had run late. Then the shoes coming off. The smell of the coffee Gerald made when he was going to be up for another hour. Gerald appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the floor, at the textbooks, at Elijah. He didn't say anything about the Jefferson program, or the board meeting, or the news story that had run in the local paper 2 weeks ago, the one with Elijah's photo that had made Claudette both proud and nervous in equal measure. He just looked at the open book. "What is that one?" he said. "Differential geometry," Elijah said. It's geometry, but in more dimensions than 3, and curved surfaces instead of flat ones." Gerald considered this. "Like the surface of the earth," he said. "That's curved." "Exactly like that," Elijah said. "And the way distances work on a curved surface are different from the way they work on a flat one. The whole framework changes." Gerald nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had spent his career working in 3 dimensions and understood intuitively, without the formal language, what it meant for the framework to change depending on the surface you were working on. "You making progress?" he said. "Some," Elijah said. "I got stuck earlier on the visualization part. You'll get there, Gerald said. Not a performance. Not a parent speech about believing in yourself. Just a statement of fact from a man who measured things for a living and had never yet encountered a problem that didn't have a solution if you looked at it long enough and carefully enough, and without flinching. He went to make his coffee. Elijah turned back to the book. The kitchen light buzzed. He read. The afternoon Elijah found Constance Hale was in late March. He hadn't been looking for her. He had been at the public library on Clement. Not the community branch, but the main branch. The one with the high ceilings and the periodicals room that stayed open until 8. Working on a paper Weston had assigned about the historical development of calculus. The assignment required primary sources, which meant the physical archive section on the 3rd floor, which meant working with actual documents in a way that felt different from a screen. More real. More like the thing itself. He had been there for 3 hours when he looked up and saw her. She was at a table near the window. Not the periodicals room, the general reading room. The one with the long tables and the afternoon light coming through the tall windows. She had books in front of her, and a notepad and a pen. And she was working in the focused way of someone with nowhere else to be, and something they actually wanted to do. She hadn't seen him. He could have walked out through the side exit. He'd come in through the main entrance, and the archive section was at the back. But the side exit was close enough that he could have taken it without being seen, and gotten home the slightly longer way, and never mentioned that he had been in this library on this afternoon. He stood in the doorway between the archive section and the reading room for a moment. Then he walked toward her table. She looked up when he was 3 steps away. Her expression moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, recognition, something that pulled back before it became readable, and then settled into a stillness that was not comfortable but was honest. Elijah, she said. Mrs. Hale, he said. He stood there for a moment. Can I? He started. She gestured at the chair across from her. He sat. They looked at each other across the table. Between them, her books. A text on the history of mathematics. A notebook with handwriting on the open page. And a paper, a printed article. He could see the journal header at the top that she'd been annotating in the margins. He looked at the journal header. Journal of Mathematics and Architecture. Applications in Structural Design. Something from 2019. New work. Not a retrospective, she noticed him looking. I'm auditing a course, she said, at the community college on computational design methods. She said it without apology and without explanation. Just a fact. I read your paper, he said, the one from 1998, about bridge and road design. She was still. I found it in the faculty publication database. When I was looking for supplementary materials last fall, he looked at the annotated article in front of her. You wrote about the way differential geometry applies to surface curvature in structural load distribution. I didn't understand all of it at the time. I understand more of it now. She said nothing for a moment. Then, what are you reading now? He told her about the differential geometry text, about the place where his intuition ran out, about what Weston had said about that being the right place to get stuck. She was quiet for a moment after that, looking at the table. The problem with getting stuck, she said slowly, is that it feels like failure even when it isn't. The first time I really got stuck in graduate school. Not the ordinary stuck. The kind where you know you can work through it, but the kind where you genuinely couldn't see a path. I convinced myself it meant something about my limits, that I had hit the ceiling. She paused. I was 24. I pulled back from the hardest materials, a safer path. Longer. I've thought about that a lot recently, Elijah said. Weston says the stuck is where the real education begins. He's right, she said. Yes, he's right. They sat in the library with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, and the sound of pages turning somewhere in desks, and a child asking a question at the reference desk on the floor below. I owe you more than an apology, she said. I know that. There isn't a version of what I did that apology covers. She was looking at the table, but I want to say it anyway. What I did to you was wrong. All of it. The ruler. Her voice didn't waver on the last word. She had decided apparently to say it directly. The eraser. I knew you were right, and I erased it anyway, and that is the one I think about most. Why that one? He said. She looked up. The others, she slowly, I can give you reasons for, even if the reasons were wrong. Fear, habit, pride, but the erasing, I looked at your work, and I knew exactly what it was, and I erased it. In front of you. In front of the class. She shook her head slightly. That wasn't fear. That was something worse. He thought about the 4 seconds of silence, the way the room had gone still, Cody's mouth open. Nadia looking up from her desk. I know why you did it, he said. She looked at him. James Whitfield, he said. On 15 years of deciding that the thing you saw in him was a mistake. And then seeing the same thing in me and deciding you couldn't afford to be wrong. And he paused. I'm not saying that makes it right. It doesn't. But I understand the calculation. She was very still. Dr. Weston told me James is finishing his master's degree, Elijah said. In applied mathematics. A breath, barely visible. But there. He told me, she said. The long road, Elijah said. Yes. He reached into his bag. He had been carrying the library textbook, the original one, the differential geometry text. But beneath it in the folder at the back of his bag, he had the spiral notebook from last fall. Not the green one Hale had torn. A different one. The one he'd started after that, where he'd rewritten everything from memory. He took out a single page, a solution from the board. Rewritten in full, both substitutions, every step, the alternative approach noted at the bottom. He'd made for a reason he hadn't fully articulated to himself at the time. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at it. The handwriting. The solution. The thing she'd erased. I thought you should have a copy, he said, since the original didn't survive. She looked up at him. There was something in her face that was a Fulford reading room. Too large for a Thursday afternoon in March. Too large, maybe, for words to hold. She wasn't going to name it. He wasn't going to name it either. Some things don't need naming to be true. She reached out and picked up the page, folded it once, carefully, held it. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He put his bag over his shoulder. And he left her there in the afternoon light, with his solution in her hands and her annotated journal article and her notebook, full of new mathematics and the long road in front of her still going somewhere. 3 months after the board meeting. February had become March, had become the particular early April morning when the air still has winter in it, but the light has changed, when you can feel the tilt of the planet shifting and it shows in the way the shadows fall at 7 in the morning. Elijah was on his way to Jefferson. He walked this route 3 mornings a week now. 31 minutes from the apartment on Garfield to the Jefferson High Mathematics Wing, door to door, if he kept a reasonable pace. He knew this because he had timed it on the first day, and then stopped timing it because it had become the walk, not a measurement. He passed the hardware store where Gerald bought lumber in 12-foot lengths on Saturdays. He passed the corner where the bus on Clover had broken down in November. He passed the library branch where he had taken out a calculus textbook 6 months ago and kept it 3 weeks past its due date. He thought about the due date. He thought about how the overdue fine had been $2.40. And he had paid it from his own money, and the librarian at the desk had processed it without comment, which was exactly the correct response to a 13-year-old, returning a graduate-level calculus text 3 weeks late. But he turned the corner onto Jefferson's block. The school was awake, in a way that Fairview wasn't at this hour. Jefferson started 20 minutes earlier, and the student population was older, and the particular energy of high school students in the morning was different from middle school students, less volatile and more directed, the kind of energy that had somewhere specific to go. He went to room 214. Dr. Weston was not there yet. He was rarely there before Elijah on Tuesday and Thursday sessions. He was always there on Mondays. This was a pattern Elijah had noticed without mentioning. He sat down at the table by the window, took out the differential geometry text, found where he'd stopped the night before, page 107, the section on Riemannian manifolds, which was where his intuition kept running out, and he kept coming back anyway. He opened the notebook. Read what he'd written the previous evening. The incomplete proof, the place where it stopped. He picked up his pencil. He thought about what Weston had said. The place where your intuition runs out is where mathematics requires something more, not less of you, more. Up the extension into space you can't see clearly yet, and the staying there until the seeing develops. He made a mark on the page, a tentative one, looked at it, made another. The door opened and a student came in, a junior, someone he'd seen in the hall full before, part of the advanced section that used this room before Elijah's session. She looked at him. You're the kid, she said, not kindly, curious. From the board meeting. I'm a student, he said, like you. She considered this. Fair, she said. She picked up a textbook she'd left on the back shelf. Is Weston any good? Yes, Elijah said. Does he let you figure things out yourself, or does he just tell you? He lets you figure it out, Elijah said. He's very patient. Good, she said. I hate when teachers tell you the answer before you've had a chance to be stuck. Me too, he said. She left. He turned back to his notebook. The mark he'd made on the page was not a solution. It was the beginning of an approach. The beginning of the beginning, the kind of first move that might lead somewhere or might turn out to be wrong and need to be erased, actually erased with an actual eraser, in the ordinary way that mathematics required, not as punishment but as part of the process. He was not afraid of erasing. He had never been afraid of erasing. He was afraid of other people erasing his work. That was a different fear with a different source, and it was smaller now than it had been in November. Still there, but smaller. The kind of thing you carry because you've learned to. Weston came in at 8:03. He saw the notebook open on the table, the mark Elijah had made. He set down his coat and his bag and his coffee and came to look. He didn't say anything right away. He read what was on the page. The incomplete proof and the tentative first move and the thinking visible in the margins. This direction, he said, pointing to the mark. Why? Because the curvature formula from page 93 suggests that the local behavior should be consistent with this approach, even though the global behavior is more complex. I think. He paused. I might be wrong. You might be, Weston said. Try the other direction, which is. Elijah thought about it, described it. Weston nodded once. Start with your direction first, he said. See where it goes. He sat down across the table. Elijah picked up his pencil, and he began. On a school across the city, in a classroom that used to be Constance Hale's, a young teacher named Mr. Diaz was drawing a coordinate plane on the board and asking the class what it would look like if the plane were curved instead of flat. And a girl in the back corner named Nadia Okonkwo was raising her hand before he'd even finished the question. On the hardware store on Garfield Street, Gerald Osei was choosing lumber for a weekend project, running his thumb along the grain of each board to check for warping, doing the calculation in his head because he always did the calculation in his head. And on the wall of his workshop at home, under a piece of plywood that served as a makeshift corkboard, was a printout of his son's name in the district's announcement of the Strand Whitfield program's inaugural cohort. He hadn't put it there to show anyone. He had put it there because he walked past it every morning before he left for work. In the community college across town, a classroom that held 22 adult students, ranging in age from 19 to 63. Constance Hale was sitting in the second row with her notebook open and her pen moving, and the instructor was discussing the computational methods for surface analysis and structural design, and she was not the smartest person in the room, or the fastest or the most experienced, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In a graduate mathematics office at the university, Dr. Aubrey Weston's filing cabinet held in a marked folder simply with a year, a photograph. Not recent, from 1994. A boy at a chalkboard. Young, 16, wire-rimmed glasses he'd had to borrow from someone for the photo, working through a problem that no one in the room had expected him to solve. The photograph was not in the filing cabinet because Weston had been hiding it. It was there because he looked at it sometimes when he needed to remember what the work was actually for. He had not found Michael Strand. He had not stopped believing Michael Strand existed somewhere, still thinking in 3 dimensions, still finding the structure before it was named, still carrying the mathematics that had never belonged to anyone else. He thought the Strand Whitfield program was a good name. He thought it was the right way to keep looking. And in room 214 at Jefferson High, in the early April morning with the light changed and the shadows falling differently and the school awake around him, Elijah Osei worked through a proof on Riemannian manifolds that he might get right or might get wrong, that if finished today or come back to for 3 more sessions, that was hard in the way that the right things are hard. Not because they were designed to defeat you, but because they were asking you to become more than you currently were. The pencil moved, the notebook filled, the mathematics went where it was going, and nobody erased it.